They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Your kids, they're being lied to by the woke left, by their schools, even trusted counselors. And there has been an effort by the left in this country to transition kids instead of getting them the help that they need. Welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And joining us today, I'm so excited to welcome Chloe Cole into the podcast. In fact, Chloe, I talked to you. You were in our studio in Los Angeles, and you were here on my morning show that I do, The Morning Answer. I was like, you have to come on Happy Women with us. So I'm so glad you're here. Welcome in. Give her a follow at Choo Cole, CHOOO Cole. And she's an advocate. Exactly. She's an advocate for kids, faith, and the truth. And Chloe, congratulations on all your great successes. I really have seen you've been everywhere. And welcome to Happy Women.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words, and thanks for having me on.
Now, typically we jump right into the issue, but your story, Chloe, is so compelling. Really, we have the time. Spread out and tell us what you went through as a young child and what happened to you in the school system, and really kind of how your parents almost felt like they were almost threatened to go along with it. Give us the details on what happened with you.
So I'm a detransitioner. I'm somebody who underwent the process of a medical gender transition and came back out of it permanently. I have decided to not only reject my transgender identity, but also the drugs and the treatments that I was on, and return to an identity as my birth sex, as the way that God has beautifully created me. And I also had gone through all of that while I was still a child, between the ages of 12 to 16. And it's something it's an issue that I feel very passionate about, not only because of the way that it's affected me personally and my health, but also my family and those around me. It was very difficult for them to go through, especially my mom and dad, with the way that they were manipulated and lied to by the adults around us. And I know many other men and women who have gone through this at various stages in their lives. Many of them were children as well. And I believe firmly that children deserve to be able to grow up, being able to build their identity and appreciate themselves the way that they were made, without being led down a lifetime of being beholden to a predatory medical system.
So would you be willing to talk a little bit about how did the whole process start? I mean, just if you're willing to talk about it, I'd love to hear, how did you start down the path? What were the influences?
So from a very young age, I had been sort of a more tomboyish kind of girl. And I mean, I've got quite a few older brothers, and I found that I tended to, the older I got, the more that I felt like I related to them and my male peers than I did my mother, my sisters, my female peers at school. In a lot of ways, I felt like I shared my interest with them a lot more. I shared my values with them. I shared a lot of my personality and my sense of humor with them. And it just got really difficult to connect with other girls, especially as I was going through puberty. I felt something just felt different. And that's something that's very common for a lot of women, a lot of girls who are going through those formative years of their lives. But something just made me feel very different from really everybody around me from a very young age. I had a difficult time connecting with people, understanding how to socialize, understanding how to make and keep friends. I was bullied from a young age, and I didn't really understand why people looked at me differently. And I shut myself off from the world. I tried to be tough, but I still felt very lonely, very isolated. And I struggled for years to kind of get a sense of who I was in the world, especially in relation to the people around me and what my identity really was and what that really meant. So the first place that I went to was online. I started using the computer from a very young age, and it just started with playing video games and drawing and eventually browsing the internet. I got my first phone when I was about 11 years old. And that was where things really took a turn. That was when I started to use, I guess, real social media, like Instagram, Snapchat. And I was not only following my peers from school on there, but also I was browsing a lot of content that was just based around like my personal interest. And it was very innocent stuff at first. It was comics. It was video games that I would play. But there was something that was very unique about these communities. It was just full of kids, full of children my age who, outside of talking about their hobbies, they would often end up actually forming friendships and even building up a following from talking very, very honestly about their lives and being relatable. Well, a lot of them were kids who identified as members of the LGBT, and it was primarily girls who identified themselves as young men, as members of the opposite sex. And it was just something that was so unique to me. It was something like I had never heard of before at all, just completely novel. But the more that I listened to these girls' stories, the more that they sounded just like me. Girls who thought that they were tomboys for years, who didn't really feel very comfortable with their bodies, especially going through puberty, and even calling themselves girls growing up. Those are all feelings that I understood very well. And yet they seem to become so happy and finally find who they are and find happiness and acceptance through this transgender identity. I thought after a while of being exposed to it that maybe there's a reason why I felt such a deep connection to this identity, this community. Maybe it's because I was a part of it. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me that I never was supposed to be a young woman in the first place. Clearly, I was one of these little boys who was trapped in the body of a young girl, and that was the source of my unhappiness. That was why I was bullied. That was why I felt so uncomfortable going through the motions of puberty and watching my breasts develop, and why I wanted just to crawl out of my skin during that time. And I thought that this was finally going to be where I found my happiness and myself.
So you've connected now. So you've kind of gone through with us the fact that you were feeling vulnerable. You didn't feel like you belonged. You were shut off. You find this community that feels right to you. And do you start changing how you ask people to reference you? What's that next step? And did any adult try to intervene, or did any adult say, wow, you're doing this, let's push this forward? What was the reaction from the people around you, particularly adults?
It depended. Some people, I decided that I would tell almost nobody from school about it, even my teachers, because I was being bullied both by other students and by teachers and school staff. So it was like, they're not going to take me seriously. Why should I bother, right? But I had told a few closer friends of mine, both at school and on the internet, that I wanted to be referred to as a boy. And then eventually I moved on to telling some members of my family about it. It was my sister at first. And then I wrote a letter to my mom and dad, kind of detailing my feelings a little bit, telling them that I didn't want to be called Chloe anymore. I wanted to be their son. And I went through a few different names, but the gist of the letter was that I hoped that they would love me the same, and that they would accept me as I was going through these things. And for a lot of my schoolmates, it was kind of confusing to watch me change so suddenly. At first with the social transition, and eventually down the line later when I started going through the actual physical changes of being on the drugs that I was put on. Because they had no idea what was going on, and it was just something that they took as another opportunity to make fun of me for. It was just another thing to bully me over, and so I wanted nothing to really do with them. But in a sense, that kind of pushed me further into it because I wanted to prove them wrong. Now with my family and my closer friends, it was a little bit more, I wouldn't necessarily say positively taken, because a lot of them were very, very concerned about me, and they were very unsure of this, but they also weren't really exactly sure what to do. My mom and dad had they never heard anything like this before from any of my older siblings. And I was the baby of the family, and they were dealing with a completely unique problem with me now. So they tried to talk to me about it a little bit, but I didn't really know how to communicate these feelings or where they came from. So they decided, well, maybe this is a deeper psychological issues that we can't really help with, at least not on our own. Maybe we need a psychologist who can dive deeper into this, who can figure out the source of these feelings and help her to cope with it, which is, I think, a completely sane expectation to have with a psychologist with any psychiatric issue that your child has. But what my mom and dad were not expecting was that wouldn't be the case at all. That it would just be yes, 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 you are a boy. Yes, we're going to refer to you by this name. Yes, we're going to have your mom and dad go along with it. And we are not going to take no as an answer from them.
So I'm going to speak as a parent, because I'm the parent of two kids who are probably close in age to your age. And I would imagine it presented a huge dilemma for your parents, because on the one hand, your love for your child is just so great, and you want to be loving and supportive above all else. But then I can imagine how it's also scary, and you want to do the right thing as a parent. And I mean, it's a scary thing. It is. It's a huge change. It's a huge thing to be presented with. I'm just curious, as you look back on it now and seeing the way your parents reacted to you, how do you think you would react if you were a parent in the same position?
I mean, I have to agree it's totally a scary thing for parents, because adolescence and going through puberty is already rife with all these different changes. But to see something as radical as this happen with your child, for them to come up to you saying, like, I hate my body so much that I want to change this fundamental part of it. I want to be on these. I want to go on these drugs. I want to get these surgeries and remove parts of my body. That is an incredibly painful thing to hear as a parent. And I think that given the resources that my mom and dad had at the time, and even just in the media, there weren't stories like mine that were out there. There wasn't really any really significant pushback against the medical transitioning of children, mostly because people didn't even know that it was a thing that was happening at the time. Things were completely different then. And everything led them in the direction of saying yes or to medical resources, rather than just allowing me to wait these feelings out and naturally grow through them, which is the model of care that doctors used to follow for children who have sex-related distress. Most of them, in the single biggest study of gender-confused children, when left alone, most of them would end up desisting and reintegrating with their identity and becoming comfortable again with their birth sex. But now the medical community was not going to afford my mom and dad and I that option. They were told that there was no other choice, that it was going to be life or death for me. They used adult transgender suicide statistics to convince my mom and dad that the longer that they went saying no and not allowing me to undergo this treatment, the more likely it would be that going through puberty would actually drive me to suicide, which is a complete fallacy. If I were allowed to go through puberty, more likely than not, that would have ended up being the cure to these feelings.
When we first talked, Chloe, I think that's what stood out for me is thinking what your parents were going through, and literally having a doctor. We trust our doctors. We're supposed to trust our doctors, or be able to, and to have a doctor say, if you don't allow your kid to get this care or put these drugs in her body, then you're going to lose her. She's going to kill herself. I mean, imagine that. What is a parent? You're not going to let your child kill themselves in front of you. I mean, it's ridiculous. So after you seek this medical help, how soon after do they put you on drugs, and what did those drugs do to you? And kind of take us through that piece of what happened after you started this transition.
I think it was roughly about 6 months or so between my initial therapy appointment, the first one I had ever had in my entire life for any psychological issue, and actually being prescribed my first treatments. And so that was, I think it was around like the 3 to 4 month mark when I was actually referred to a few endocrinologists to already talk about going on these drugs. And the first treatment that I was put on was the puberty blockers, which were, they use a drug called Lupron to suppress the puberty of gender confused children. And usually they'll say, a lot of these activists and these doctors will claim like, oh, it's just a pause button. It gives the child some time to kind of decide whether they want to go through with their natural puberty, or if they want to try and simulate the puberty of the opposite sex with cross-sex hormones and surgeries, which doesn't work that way. You can't just stop you can't stop a bodily process, and the only one through which a child can become an adult, and expect there not to be consequences. And it also pushes children further into the process, because the moment that you affirm, that's when they feel set. They feel comfortable because an adult is telling them, yes, I can do this. And the very effects of it are horrific, because what Lupron actually is a chemical castration drug. It's been used in sex offenders. It's been used in cancer patients who have more advanced forms of it. And it's, when you're a girl, when you're already pubescent, it basically puts you into an artificial childhood onset menopause. So I was 13 years old. I was a little 8th grader who was experiencing things like hot flashes, these uncomfortable, burning, tingling sensations in my body. Emotionally, I was very, very numb on it. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't get pleasure out of everyday activities that I used to enjoy, like drawing, playing games. It felt horrible to be on. So of course I wanted to move on to the next treatment, which was the testosterone. And that's, I think, just after my first shot of the puberty blockers was when I had the prescription written. And so it was a very fast course of treatment. It was only like a month or two between getting the first shot of the blockers and then having my first shot of testosterone, which would occur, which would be every single week, every day for 3 years.
Wow. So I'm curious, how did that make you feel? Because I've heard descriptions that going on to testosterone is very, very difficult because it causes a lot of like emotional changes. It causes a lot of tension and a lot of problems. Did you experience that?
I definitely did, especially later down the line, and as my dose was increased exponentially over the years. At first, like, I felt excited to be on it. I felt like I was satisfied, like I was happy even. Because like I was looking forward to all these changes, to looking more like a young man, sounding like a young man. And I actually passed as a member of the opposite sex after a while of being on it. I looked like any other 14, 15, 16-year-old boy, and I even had a deeper voice than almost all of my male peers while I was on the steroids. It was pretty crazy. And so I went through pretty much almost all of my high school years being treated as a young man, using the male restrooms, using the locker rooms, integrating into male social spaces. And so it was just a completely different life. And it was very novel, very exciting in a lot of ways. One of the immediate changes was the changes in how I thought, how I behaved, how I experienced emotions. And it's kind of like a stimulant in a way, especially at higher doses. Like you feel more energetic, you feel more confident, you feel a little bit more competitive because it's testosterone. Mm-hmm. It's an androgen. It's the male sex hormone. And eventually, after a while, though, I started to experience both physical and psychological complications because it can make it a lot more difficult to, at least if you're a woman, at least with my own experience on it, to process negative emotions like anger, sadness. It makes it a lot more difficult to cry, which I mean, that's a very important way of processing difficult things that you're going through, I think. And so I had less of an outlet to really do that. And I was going through, there were a lot of things that I was going through during my high school years. And this just exacerbated that. But I also physically started to have issues with like pelvic pain. Like every now and then it was worse than any period cramps I'd ever had in my life. And I would just drop to the floor because I was in so much pain. And I started to experience like different pelvic issues, even like blood clots in my urine and like UTIs almost every month at a certain point.
Wow.
And it was terrifying to be on, but I was so convinced that like, I was so scared that I would have to go off of it because these drugs were so connected to my identity. I thought that I couldn't be myself without looking like and sounding like and having the hormonal profile of a young man, because I thought that I had this condition that that made it so that I couldn't live without these drugs.
So when was that moment? You're going through physical pain, you're going through now some mental anguish as well. What was the moment when you thought maybe this isn't for me, maybe I need to do something? And how did you address that? Did you go to your family first or to the doctor? What was their reaction?
That didn't happen until after I had surgery, actually. It was the surgery I had that was a major turning point in my attitude and in the surgery
before feeling that it was a mistake.
Yeah, I was very confident in my transition and in my identity as a young man up until that point. But the surgery was just so radical in every single way. It impacted me in a way that I was completely unprepared for, that I don't think that any child or anybody really is prepared for. I had to cope with the loss of entire organs and very intimate organs off of my body. I had a double mastectomy before I was even old enough to drive a car. I didn't even have a license yet. I didn't have a permit. I had never operated a vehicle in my life. I never even had a first kiss. And yet, to my doctors, it was okay to completely remove my breasts. In the initial week, I thought, well, I'm finally over the hardest part of this, and I feel like I'm strong. I'm being celebrated by my friends for going through this, and I'm going to be able to take my shirt off at the pool and not have to worry about like people making comments about my binder or something. But that never happened. Not only did I never fully heal, it also started to hit me just how wrong all this was. Very slowly over time. It was a very slow burn. But I think those feelings of grief were there for a very long time. I think what really ended up being the nail in the coffin was when I was studying psychology my junior year of high school, and I learned a little bit about like how children formatively develop. Mentally, behaviorally, socially, between infancy and adulthood. And I learned a little bit about myself. I learned about things like attachment styles and how important the style of raising a child is to their personality development and the kind of person that they become as an adult. And I realized that I had attachment issues. I realized that my identity issues were not because I was a boy, but because I felt isolated from a very young age. And it was really groundbreaking, but when I started to learn about things like breastfeeding, I mean, I remember during those lessons, I would look down at my chest. I would imagine an infant at my chest and just sob because I would never be able to do that. There were only scars. There no longer were breasts with which that I could feed my future children. And it made me think about a lot of things. Not only about the fact that my transition was a complete lie, but also that it was taking away parts of my life and my adulthood before I even could understand what that meant. And I wanted to have kids. I wanted to naturally have children and become a mother and become a wife one day. But I had no idea how important that would be to me because I still very much was a child. And I wasn't just given the opportunity to grow up by these doctors who knew so much better. And it was that epiphany that ultimately drove me out of my transition. And I made the decision at 16 to stop because I knew that it was wrong. I knew that it was hurting me and I couldn't go any further into it. I was just so terrified of the complications killing me or of going completely infertile and never being able to have children in a normal romantic relationship ever again. I couldn't keep doing this.
So I'm curious, when you decided to stop, did the doctors support you or did you meet a lot of resistance?
It was like they didn't care about me anymore.
Wow.
They didn't want to look at their mistake.
Oh,
I would often hear things like, I've never even seen a patient like you before, which wasn't true. I ended up meeting another girl actually who had a lot of my same exact doctors who had the same exact outcome. She was younger than I, and she ended up detransitioning like I did. So I was lied to. But sometimes they would push back against this idea and say, well, what if you're non-binary? What if this is just another part of your transition, a continuation of your gender journey, which was like a total slap to the face because I wanted it to end. It wasn't a journey, it was a nightmare. And when I would go to different physicians and even my surgeon for complications that I was having, or even just asking for help with basic things like getting my hormone levels tested regularly and getting my results back with a chart for female hormone levels so I could understand where I was at, they wouldn't do things like that. And I lost so much trust in my doctors and in the medical field that I think it's been 3-4 years since I've last seen any physician for anything, because I just have so much distrust and so much pain around medicine.
You know, I think you're so brave for telling the story. It is so deeply personal. And I know the next step, or I would ask, I guess, the next step after you started going back to your biological sex and you felt like you lost trust in your doctors and you're kind of rebuilding who you are. I mean, that's a huge journey. You're still 16, you're rebuilding who you are. When did you feel compelled to tell people your story to try to help? Was there a moment where you're like, wow, I need to speak on this because there are other kids who are going down the same path?
I mean, at first, those first few months were very dark for me. I was trying to go back to school after years of everybody believing and truly thinking that I was a young man. I looked like a young man. And to come back as people thought that I was a transgender boy, actually. They thought that I was a young man who was trying to emulate the role of a woman, which was very painful for me because I knew the truth. And I wanted to just completely shed myself of that association with the transgender community because I was no longer transgender. I was losing friends for all sorts of different reasons. I was not emotionally stable. I was not getting the help that I needed physically or psychologically. So I was very sickly. And a lot of my friends were, I would say, fairly left-leaning. Some of them were transgender even, and they just completely got rid of me from their lives. They wanted nothing to do with me. And I just felt like a freak my senior year of high school. Which was really painful because for a lot of people, it's the most easygoing, it's the most fun year of their high school years. But I really didn't have much. And I ended up dropping out of high school my last year and just ended up getting a diploma equivalent because I had no reason to really be there anymore. I couldn't focus on my studies. I had no friends and I had nowhere to go there really. But eventually I started to discover that there was a community of other detransitioners online. And from very early on, I felt compelled to become a voice for a community that was very much voiceless at the time, but also rapidly growing. I was meeting so many new people who had this exact pain, who had this exact experience. But one thing that I found really interesting was that there were no other kids. There was nobody who I'd met was nearly as young as me. But I knew that there were other children out there because I'd seen them in the clinics. I'd seen them in the hospitals they were waiting for the same exact treatments as me. I knew that I wasn't alone, and I wanted to let these other children know that I wasn't alone. So I decided to speak up, and it just started with a few posts on Twitter. It started very small. And eventually I had entire publications and I had journalists reaching out to me. Eventually I was doing news hits, and I was asked to speak on legislation to help protect other children from going through what I did. I never thought that I would be a public speaker. I never thought that I would be helping to write legislation or speak in churches or with communities across the US or traveling as much as I do. But when I was a little girl, I had dreams of going out into the world and making many friends and making the world a better place. And I feel like that dream has started to actualize in the last few years of my life. And I'm very grateful that, especially to my mom and dad, for saying yes to something that they were very nervous about letting me do. Because I was 17 at the time. I wasn't even legally an adult yet. And all of a sudden, I was about to go out into the world in a way that none of us had even conceived of before. But it's been quite a journey these last 3 years.
I mean, for people who don't know your story, you've been just an absolute hero. I follow you on social media. I've seen you speak on a number of occasions, and you pop up everywhere. You are just, I think, one of the bravest and the most moving and most articulate speakers on this issue. So I just commend you. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what you've had to suffer, but I think it's also incredible how you've taken it and turned it into a real gift for others. So I really commend you and thank you for what you do. Can't wait to see what comes next. I think there's more in store for you. It's going to be really great to watch your career and your life.
I agree with you. And Chloe, just in our final moment here, what do you want people to know? Kids who are in the position that you were in, what's your message for them and for their families?
Well, I think that every single one of us, we all have our struggles, and some are harder than others. But as difficult as the things that I've been through have been, I'm very grateful. I'm grateful for the good and the bad, because I would not be the young woman who I am today without any of it. If I hadn't lost my breasts, if I hadn't gone through these different trials and tribulations in my childhood, I don't think I would be nearly as strong as I am today. It takes going through strife to become a stronger person. And especially for those of you out there, those of you young people who are struggling with these feelings around your identity, around your sex, it's something that you have to face head on if you want to get through it. You can't run away from these feelings. And just saying and giving in to these feelings, these thoughts of maybe I'm not good enough the way that I was made. You're running away from your real problems. It's not your sex. It's not the way that you were born.
Well, we appreciate you and all of your strength and courage
that you have to face. You have to face where these feelings are really coming from. But you can find your identity through something outside of the way that you look, outside of what name you call yourself. I believe that where our identity really comes from, yes, part of it comes from our sex. Part of it comes from the things that we cannot change. But we mainly shape ourselves through the things that we do, through the choices that we make, especially for those around us. I think most of our personal success comes from not the things that we do for ourselves, but the changes that we make in the lives of the people around us and in the world around us.
Yeah. Well, Chloe, you are amazing and strong, and we just are blessed to spend time with you. And thank you so much for telling people your story. And want to encourage everybody to follow her at Chuth, CH3OO Cole, COLE. Chloe Cole, thanks so much for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. All right. And don't forget to get Katie's book. It's called Next Gen Marxism, available wherever you get your books, always at katiegorka.org as well. And you can search her out, Catherine Gorka on Facebook, Gorka Katie on X. You can find me on social media as well, Jennifer Horn Radio on Instagram and Facebook, at Jennifer Horn on X and on Truth. And thank you for sharing the podcast with your friends. Make sure you continue those 5-star ratings. We love them. And you can connect on all of our platforms at SalemPodcastNetwork.com/Happy Women. Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.